When Douglas Hartwell died, his second wife inherited the Rosedale mansion, the ski chalet in Whistler, and 43% of a natural gas company worth nearly $3 billion. His stepchildren divided the rest like hungry birds picking at a carcass. His eldest daughter, his only biological child, received a single tarnished pocket watch that hadn't kept time in 30 years. But that pocket watch was not what it appeared to be. The law offices of Kellner, Brochu and Associates occupied the 31st floor of a Bay Street tower in downtown Toronto, the kind of building where the elevator music was classical, and the receptionist looked at you like you'd arrived at the wrong address. The carpets were the deep burgundy of old money. The windows looked out over Lake Ontario, grey and flat on that February morning, the kind of cold that made the city feel sealed shut. Cecily Hartwell, 48 years old, sat at the far end of a conference table that could have seated 20. She was still wearing her winter coat because she hadn't thought to take it off, and her canvas tote bag, the one with the Winnipeg Art Gallery logo faded on the side, sat on the floor beside her sensible boots, both slightly damp from the slush outside. She had driven 11 hours from Winnipeg in a rental car because she couldn't afford to fly on short notice. She'd taken 3 personal days from her job teaching biology at Elmwood Secondary, and she would have to mark 47 lab reports when she got home. She had not come expecting anything. She had come because Graham Kellner, her father's lawyer, had called her directly and said she needed to be present. Those were the exact words he used: needed to be present, not invited, not welcome. He had left no room for negotiation. Douglas Hartwell had been a self-made man in the way Canadians sometimes are. Quietly, methodically, with very little flair, he had built Hartwell Energy Solutions from a 2-room office in Calgary in 1981 into one of the largest independent natural gas distribution companies in Western Canada. He had been private to the point of secretiveness. He had given money to children's hospitals and Indigenous land restoration projects without once attending a gala. He had been profiled in the Globe and Mail only twice, and both times he'd declined to provide a photograph. He had also, when Cecily was 14, married Renata Holloway, a woman 16 years his junior, who had opinions about everything and warmth toward almost nothing. Renata had 2 children from a previous marriage, Owen, now 39, who managed a boutique hotel in Kelowna and had twice been investigated by the Better Business Bureau, and Sylvia, 36, who ran a lifestyle brand on Instagram and carried a deep, sustained hostility toward anyone who didn't immediately validate her. Cecily had refused to pretend any of them were her family. She had finished high school, put herself through a biology degree at the University of Manitoba, taken her teaching certification, and built a life that did not require Douglas Hartwell's approval. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times in the last decade, stiff phone calls, birthdays missed, Christmas cards with no personal note. She had loved him anyway. That was the part she could never quite explain. Renata sat at the head of the table in a black cashmere wrap that probably cost more than Cecily's car. Her grief, if she had any, was imperceptible beneath careful makeup and an expression of mild impatience. Owen sat to her left, scrolling his phone with his thumb, wearing a jacket that strained slightly across the shoulders. Sylvia was beside him, picking at the label on a water bottle, her jaw tight. Graham Kellner sat at the opposite end of the table. He was 71, if she had to guess, small, precise, with the kind of posture that suggested he had never once in his life slouched. His silver hair was combed with the exactitude of a man who had been doing it the same way for 50 years. His expression gave away nothing. He cleared his throat once and the room went quiet. "We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Douglas Raymond Hartwell," he said. Mr. Hartwell was explicit in his wishes that this be conducted without interruption. Cecily folded her hands in her lap and looked at the surface of the table. The will was long, and Kellner read it steadily, without theatre, to Renata. The Rosedale property, the Whistler chalet, the Okanagan vineyard acquired in 2019, and controlling interest in Hartwell Energy Solutions, held through a numbered corporation called 7842301 Canada Inc. To Owen, a commercial property portfolio in Vancouver and a trust fund valued at $18 million. To Sylvia, the art collection, the vacation property in Prince Edward County, and a cash trust of $12 million. Cecily listened to the numbers the way you listen to heavy rain when you're already inside. It was noise, expected noise. And finally, Kellner said, turning a page, "To my daughter, Cecily Ann Hartwell." The room sharpened. For her self-sufficiency, which she demonstrated without ever once asking my permission, and for her refusal to trade her integrity for comfort, I leave my pocket watch, the one her grandfather brought from Glasgow in 1947. It no longer keeps time. I never had it repaired. I should have. Kellner reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small object on the conference table, sliding it towards Cecily with 2 fingers. It was a watch, silver-toned and scratched, the case worn smooth in places from decades of handling. It spun once on the polished wood and stopped. Owen made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Sylvia looked away to hide her smile and didn't quite succeed. Renata did not smile. She looked at Cecily with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a specific moment to arrive and finds that it exceeds expectations. "Well," she said, adjusting the cuff of her wrap, "at least it's something with sentimental value. You always did put such stock in that sort of thing." Cecily looked at the watch. She felt something move through her chest. Not pain exactly, more like a door closing in a room she'd kept open for 30 years out of habit. She reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. "That concludes the reading," Kellner said softly. Cecily pushed her chair back, put the watch in the pocket of her coat, picked up her tote bag, and walked toward the door with her chin level and her breathing controlled. She made it into the corridor before her eyes went completely blurry. She found a women's washroom at the end of the hall, pushed into a stall, sat down on the closed lid of the toilet, and pressed the heels of both hands against her eye sockets. She was not a person who cried easily. She had not cried at his funeral 3 weeks ago, standing in the February cold at Mount Pleasant Cemetery with 100 people she didn't know. She cried now. Hard, ugly, silent crying that shook her shoulders. The kind you have to swallow rather than let out. It wasn't the money. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. It wasn't the money. It was 34 years of a relationship she could never quite name, not estranged, not close. Something unfinished that had now been finished without her consent, by a document read aloud in a room that smelled of lemon polish and other people's ambition. She was still in the stall when she heard the washroom door open. "Miss Hartwell," Kellner's voice from just inside the door. "Cecily, I apologize for the intrusion. When you're ready, I need 2 minutes of your time, in private." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I'll be right out." She found him standing in the corridor, and something had shifted in him. The formality had gone out slightly, like a coat removed. He was watching the elevators, then glancing back, in a way she wouldn't have expected from a man his age. "This isn't the place," he said quietly. "The conference room is monitored. Your stepmother had a security consultant go through this building 6 months ago. Your father knew." Cecily stared at him. "What are you talking about?" He knew Renata was watching. He spent the last 4 years making sure that everything she saw confirmed exactly what she expected to see. Kellner reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small sealed envelope, the kind stationery stores used to carry. "He left instructions that I was not to give you this in that room, only here. Only after you'd taken the watch and left under your own power." "Why does it matter whether I left?" "Because that was the condition he set. Not for you, for himself. He needed to know, before any of this transferred to you, that you had the same temperament at 48 that you had at 14, that you would pick up what he gave you and walk out of a room full of people, laughing at you with your head up." Kellner held out the envelope. He called it the last thing he could teach you. Cecily took it. Her hands were steadier than she expected. Is there somewhere we can go? Kellner pressed the elevator button for the underground garage. My car. They rode down in silence. His car was a grey Volvo, not new, parked in a reserved spot with his name on a placard. He started the engine and pulled out before either of them spoke. Douglas came to me in 2020 with a very specific problem, Kellner said, merging onto the Gardiner Expressway heading east. He had discovered, through his own investigation, that Owen had been skimming from the hotel management contracts. A fairly sophisticated scheme involving accounts payable manipulation. More importantly, he discovered that Renata had been working with Owen to accelerate a succession process. They were pressuring him to sign certain transfers of authority. He'd had 2 TIAs, small strokes, and they were using his recovery period to push through documentation while his judgment was impaired. Strokes? Cecily said. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell you because the moment Renata understood he loved you, you became leverage. His silence was protection. Kellner changed lanes smoothly. He hired a private physician through a clinic in London, Ontario, not affiliated with any hospital Renata had relationships with. The physician confirmed that the TIAs were being managed with a medication protocol that kept him stable, but cognitively slower than he needed to be. The drugs weren't causing the strokes. They were simply making certain he never fully recovered his sharpness between them. Cecily pressed her fingertips to her mouth. The highway slid past. Lake Ontario was out the passenger window, white and frozen to the horizon. He had them arrested? He couldn't. Not without triggering a shareholder crisis. Hartwell Energy supplies natural gas to 400,000 homes in Alberta and Saskatchewan. A public fraud case involving the founder's family during a regulatory review period. The company's credit rating collapses, financing dries up, and service interruptions start within a year. He wasn't willing to do that to those customers. He was also, frankly, still protecting Owen, in the way that fathers sometimes protect people who have treated them very badly. Kellner paused. So he fought them a different way. The envelope was still in Cecily's hands. She turned it over, then broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, heavy cream stock, her father's handwriting in blue ink. She had not seen his handwriting in years. It was smaller than she remembered, more careful. Cecily, if you're reading this in Graham's car, then you did what I expected you to do. You took an insult with grace, and you walked out. I'm sorry for the theater. Renata needed to believe she had won, or she would never have stopped watching you. Look at the watch. Push it inward, not upward. Press and hold for 3 seconds. I love you. I should have said it more often. I let too many years go because I was afraid of how much it would hurt if something happened to you. That was cowardice, not love. I'm sorry. Everything comes after the watch. Cecily read it twice. The second time her vision blurred and she blinked until it cleared. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the watch. The winding stem was a small knob at the 2 o'clock position on the case. She pressed it straight inward, not the usual sideways wind, and held it. 3 seconds. 4, then she felt it, a faint click, like a tiny latch releasing deep inside the mechanism. The back of the watch, which she had assumed was solid, separated along an invisible seam. The entire rear panel swung open on a minute hinge, revealing a shallow cavity perhaps 3 millimeters deep. Inside, held in place by a fold of tissue, was a USB drive roughly the size of her thumbnail and a flat rectangular key card with a magnetic strip. Oh, she said. The watch belonged to your grandfather, Kellner said quietly. Your father had it modified by a watchmaker in Zurich in 2021. The internal mechanism still works. Mostly. What's on the drive? Everything. Kellner took the exit for Highway 401 East. For the past 4 years, Douglas was quietly converting Hartwell Energy's secondary assets, mineral rights in the Athabasca region, offshore royalty streams, decommissioned pipeline infrastructure that turned out to have significant resale value to a battery metals company, into physical, untraceable holdings, bearer instruments, registered in the name of a land-holding company called Cairn Properties Limited, incorporated in Nova Scotia, with beneficial ownership transferred to you as of January 15th of this year. Cecily set the watch carefully in her lap. Where? The Gatineau Hills, he said. Quebec sighed. Your father acquired the property in 2009 through 4 separate arm's-length transactions. It doesn't appear in any family documentation. It doesn't appear in his estate, because legally it stopped being his estate the moment the transfer completed. Kellner glanced at her. Renata's lawyers did a full asset trace last spring. They missed it entirely. They drove for 3 hours, past Oshawa, past Kingston, through the flat grey farmland of eastern Ontario, and then across the bridge into Quebec, where the land began to fold upward into the low ancient hills of the outerways. The highway narrowed, the radio signal dropped. The late afternoon sky turned the colour of old pewter over stands of black spruce. Kellner turned off the highway at a junction with no signage and followed a gravel road for several kilometres before turning again onto a track through the trees, barely wide enough for the car. The spruce closed in on both sides, and the headlights came on automatically. My father bought a hunting camp, Cecily said. He bought a great deal more than that. The trees opened without warning. The property sat on the edge of a frozen lake, and it was enormous. A main house of Quebec fieldstone, 2 stories, dormers, a wraparound porch, with 3 outbuildings visible through the snow. It was not a chalet. It was not a cabin. It looked like something from the turn of the 20th century, the kind of building that had been added to and reinforced over 100 years until it had become something that intended to last. Snow lay thick and even on every surface. The windows were dark, but the structure was intact, sealed against the winter, and clearly maintained. Cecily got out of the car and stood in the cold. The silence was absolute in the way that only very remote places are silent. Not an absence of sound, but a presence of quiet, pressing in from the tree line and the frozen lake and the pale sky. The main house is 11,000 square feet, Kellner said, coming to stand beside her. The property is 240 acres. Your father acquired it from the estate of a Quebec industrial family in 2009. He spent 3 years having it restored, very quietly, through a contractor who signed a confidentiality agreement I drafted myself. He led her up the porch steps to a heavy plank door with iron hardware. Mounted to the left of the doorframe was a simple card reader, the kind used in parking garages and office buildings. Unremarkable unless you were looking for it. Cecily held up the key card from inside the watch and pressed it against the reader. A green light, a solid click from inside the doorframe. The door swung inward on balanced hinges. The interior was warm. The heating system was on a timer, and it smelled of wood and cold air and something faintly like cedar. The main room had a fieldstone fireplace at one end large enough to stand in. The floors were wide plank pine, dark with age. Books filled a wall of shelving that ran from floor to ceiling on either side of the fireplace. But it was the door at the back of the room that Kellner moved toward, behind a section of shelving that swung outward on a concealed pivot, revealing a staircase descending into the foundation. Cecily followed him down, one hand on the stone wall, into a room built inside the original cellar, but entirely separate from it in character. Poured concrete, leady lighting. A steel door at the far end with a biometric keypad. Index finger, right hand, Kellner said. He had your print registered in 2021. He kept a copy of your old passport application. She pressed her finger against the reader. The door unsealed, with a sound like pressure releasing. Inside, a room roughly the size of a large living space, temperature-controlled and dry. Along the left wall, industrial shelving held numbered safety deposit boxes, sealed. Along the right, a bank of locked flat files, the kind used for architectural drawings, that Kellner told her contained the original deed registrations, the bearer bond certificates, and the royalty assignment documents. At the back, a computer terminal sealed in a Pelican case with a USB port on the front panel. "The drive," Kellner said. Cecily slid the tiny drive into the port. The screen activated. A file directory appeared, and at the top of the list, labeled simply with her name, was a video file. She opened it. The man on screen was her father. He was thinner than the last time she'd seen him, his face older, and he was sitting in the chair by the fireplace in the room above them. He was wearing a flannel shirt. He looked tired and completely alert, at the same time the way people look when they have stopped pretending. "Cecily," he said, "Hi, kiddo." She pressed her hand flat against her chest. "If you're watching this, then the watch worked, and Graham got you here safely, and I managed to be more clever than Renata expected me to be." He smiled. A real smile, not the careful one she remembered from formal occasions. "I don't have a lot of time on this recording because I was having a good day, and I didn't want to push my luck. So I'll be direct. Renata and Owen think they have Hartwell energy. They're welcome to it. I spent the last 3 years quietly leveraging every secondary asset the company held and converting the proceeds into what you're looking at right now. The deposit boxes on your left contain bearer certificates and royalty instruments with a current combined value of approximately $1.4 billion. The flat files contain the land deeds for 6 properties, 3 in Quebec, 2 in British Columbia, 1 in Nova Scotia, all titled to Cairn Properties, which is yours. There's also this. His voice dropped slightly. In the back left corner, there's a locked case. Combination is your mother's birthday backwards. Inside are certified copies of everything I gathered on Owen's accounting scheme and on the medical situation. I gave the originals to a forensic accountant I hired independently. She's already filed a preliminary report with the OSC. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit received a copy last November. I timed the reporting so it would become active after my estate cleared probate, when Renata and Owen are already managing the company. Let them settle in first. Let them feel safe. He leaned toward the camera. His eyes were the same pale gray she'd known her whole life. The debt structure I put in place before I died. Renata knows about some of it, not all of it. What she doesn't know is that the primary creditor on the $400 million in equipment financing she and Owen approved last spring is a numbered company called 22291704, Nova Scotia Limited. Graham holds the beneficial ownership papers. As of this recording, that company belongs to you. When they miss the Q2 payment, and they will miss it, because I built the payment schedule specifically to make that happen once I was gone, you'll have the right to accelerate the debt and move against their shares and their personal guarantees. He paused, looked away from the camera for a moment. I know I wasn't there the way I should have been. After your mother died, I didn't know how to be a father without her, as the buffer between me and everything I was afraid to feel. That was my failure. It wasn't about you. You were the one thing I did right, and I never said it enough, and I am saying it now because this is what I have. Cecily's breath caught. Use what I've left you to do good things. There's a list on the drive of the employees at Hartwell who've been with us more than 20 years. Make sure they're taken care of when the restructuring happens, and then build something. Build whatever you want. You were always better at knowing what things were worth than I ever was. He sat back. His expression was steady. I love you, Cecily. I'm proud of every single choice you made, including every choice you made to be different from me, especially those ones. The screen went dark. She stood in the light of that underground room for a long time without speaking. Kellner waited beside her, hands clasped, giving her the silence without comment or discomfort. When she finally turned around, her face was entirely clear. Graham, she said. Yes. The Q2 payment, when does it come due? 8 weeks from Thursday. She nodded slowly and looked at the rows of deposit boxes, and then at the steel door behind her, and then at the USB drive still in the terminal. Then we have 8 weeks to get organized, she said. I'll need to request a leave of absence from my school. Can you recommend a Calgary hotel for when we deal with the Alberta properties? I can do better than that, Kellner said, and there was something in his voice that might have been relief, long held and only now released. Your father owned an apartment on 9th Avenue. It's also part of the estate. She almost laughed. 8 weeks later, the executive offices of Hartwell Energy Solutions in downtown Calgary had the specific atmosphere of an organization that has realized too late that the ground beneath it is hollow. The building was theirs, or had been. The lobby security still used the old badge system. Nobody had thought to change it, because nobody had thought to look for a reason to. Renata was on the phone when the boardroom doors opened. She spun around at the sound, and the color went out of her face in a way that was almost clinical to watch. Owen stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and struck the credenza. Cecily walked in wearing a grey blazer, her posture unhurried and entirely her own. Kellner was behind her with a file box. "What is this?" Owen said. "Good morning," Cecily said pleasantly. She set a document on the boardroom table, a formal notice from 29104 Nova Scotia Limited, accelerating $412 million in outstanding debt obligations, effective immediately, citing the missed Q2 payment and 3 covenant breaches. Certified copies of the corporate search showing beneficial ownership. Transfer documents showing current title in her name. Renata set down the phone. "You can't," she started. "The OSC filed charges yesterday morning," Kellner said, opening his file box. 18 counts related to unauthorized account transfers between 2020 and 2023. The RCMP has been executing search warrants at 3 properties since 6 this morning, including the Rosedale House and the Whistler Chalet. He laid a certified copy in front of her. "The personal guarantees you and Owen signed on the Q2 financing are attached. Once the debt is formally accelerated, your personal assets are exposed." Owen sat back down heavily. Renata looked at Cecily the way you look at something that has changed shape while you weren't watching. Something you were certain you understood, and now cannot quite identify. "He planned this," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "He planned all of this." "He spent 4 years on it," Cecily said. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out the pocket watch. Scratched, heavy, tarnished, with the rear panel now permanently held open. She set it on the boardroom table in front of Renata. "He sent it to me in a room full of people who thought it was a joke," Cecily said. "You should have paid more attention to what he gave me." She held Renata's gaze for a moment, not with cruelty, not with triumph, but with the specific expression of a person who has closed a very long outstanding account and is ready to go home. Then she turned around and walked out of the building without looking back. The elevator deposited her in the lobby. Through the glass doors, the street outside was bright with March sunlight, the kind that comes to Alberta at the tail end of winter and means it, sharp and clarifying, bouncing off the last of the snowpack. She pushed through the doors and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, face tilted toward it. She had $412 million in debt to administer. She had 240 acres in the Gatineau Hills to figure out what to do with. She had a list of 27 Hartwell employees she'd promised her father she would protect. She had phone calls to make, a principal to call before September, and she was going to be extraordinarily busy for the foreseeable future. She also had, somewhere in the stack of files Kellner had given her, a list of the names of 4 residential schools, whose records Douglas had quietly been funding an independent archive to preserve. She'd found it on the USB drive, unlabeled, tucked between the debt instruments and the deed registrations. She hadn't mentioned it to Kellner yet. She wasn't entirely sure what her father had intended her to do with it. But she thought she had an idea. She pulled out her phone and called her sister. Her actual sister, her mother's daughter from a first marriage, a woman named Brenda who lived in Saskatoon and taught kindergarten and had sent Cecily a voice note when they got the news that just said, I'm sorry, I know it's complicated. And when Brenda picked up, Cecily said, "Can you take a few days off? I have some things to tell you and I'd rather do it in person." If you're wondering what you would have done, if someone handed you a broken, worthless thing in a room full of laughter and contempt, and you had to decide in that moment whether to throw it back or pocket it and walk out with your head up. That's the question Douglas Hartwell spent 4 years waiting to see answered. His daughter answered it correctly. If this story stayed with you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Claim the Drama for more stories about the people who got the last word. And leave a comment. What would you have done with the watch?